So for those of you guys attending our AITP event for the first time, just a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit association. We really exist to offer information technology professionals opportunities for growth in their careers as well as their personal lives. Our programs include in-person dinners, virtual meetings like this one, as well as networking happy hours that we have in the Los Angeles area. Um, You'll find our members include IT executives, professionals, consultants, attorneys, educators, and students. Um, and so, being a part of our organization, you can expect to communicate with industry leaders and keep up with some of the emerging technologies, hopefully enhance your skills and make friends along the way. Um, Here's our current board. These are the guys that help make all of our programs possible. If you do have an interest in serving as a board member for 2025, or just feel inspired to be more involved, let us know in the chat, and someone from our board will reach out to you. Real quick, some upcoming events that are coming up. We've got a panel of CTOs moderated by Dr. Tony Carrer. That's happening later this month on October 24th. That's going to be at the Accenture office in downtown Los Angeles. And we'll also have at the same location in November on the 21st, product management and business analysis trends panel. So hopefully you guys can come out and join us for that. If you want more up-to-date information, what you can do is you can uh, uh, see our website at AITP-LA.org. I'll throw that in the chat right now. For our existing membership, we switched platforms from Eventbrite. So if you haven't already, check your emails for an invitation to log in for the first time. Make sure to accept your invitation and register for your account to maintain your membership status. If you did not see that email and you're on this and you're a member, please make sure to message us in the chat, and I'll make sure to get back to you after the meeting and make sure that invite gets into your inbox. If you're looking to become a member, this is a chance to become a member with $10 off. Let me see if I can give you guys the link as well. That'd probably be helpful. But membership includes a lot of benefits, a lot of networking opportunities. We have a lot of online resources and recordings of all of our past events available online. Soon that will be exclusive to our membership. You also get free or discounted access to all AITP events and our AITP partner events, as well as discounted access to 3 or more LA-based conferences or forums per year. So the cost is not too much. Make sure if you click on the link and want to join, make sure to use the code COFFEE when you sign up, and that'll pop up our discounted pricing for you. So thanks to our sponsors. We've got 3 annual sponsors as of yet. We've got iSpace. They do IT staffing, IT solutions. They have some IT offshore solutions. We've got Data Prize. They're here to bring harmony to your technology by partnering with a full service managed IT. They have complete IT solutions. And then we've got the official cybersecurity summit. It's rated a top 5 InfoSec conference worldwide. It's held in major cities across the US, connecting senior level executives with renowned information security experts and cutting edge solution providers. And so that's it for my track. I'm going to pass this off to Peter. No, sorry. I'm going to pass it off to Roger, actually, to do the introductions. Roger, please take it away.
All right. Well, you've already have a pretty good sense of who Peter Coffey is. It's my job just to say a few words in his introduction. He's a VP for Strategic Research at Salesforce.com. He has been providing annual technology forecasts to AITP and ACM for well over 25 years, and we much appreciate those insights. At Salesforce, he focuses on the acceleration of digital transformation, He's in the past, he's published 2 books. He's lectured on innovation practices and AI techniques at major business schools. His current writing often appears at diginomica.com. I'll put that into the chat in a few minutes. He's also president and co-founder of the Foundation for Intelligent Life on Earth. It's a Seattle-based nonprofit. It's a grant-making organization that supports teams which are engaged in environmental protection, climate change mitigation, and the exploration of Earth and space. Some of their currently sponsored work includes salmon fishery restoration with the Nature Conservancy, greenhouse gas emission reduction work with MIT, and community engagement fellowships with the Luskin Center at UCLA. So please welcome Peter Coffey.
Thank you very much, Roger. I've had the, I think you have just now released the screen, so I don't need to send that request, and I'm going to go ahead and kick on the lovely and talented Salesforce test pattern. We'll confirm that the technology is still doing what it's supposed to do. Looks like it's going. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the origin of what I want to share with you this evening. It's a little bit more of an introspective look behind the Salesforce Looking Glass than I've normally provided, but I think it explains something that you need to know about, why I have what I have to share with you. If you remember all the way back to February 2023, we were having an interesting time at Salesforce because we had the sharks circling. We had multiple activist investors saying, we think you guys can be doing better, and we think that we can come in and change your approach to the market. And we had some interesting conversations internally about, we do not want to follow past playbooks. We do not want to stop being a different approach. Having a so-called performance culture. Well, what did that really mean? Well, for one thing, we fought off the sharks. The stock price came back. They went away with their money. But even though we had some really great days, even though we've had some fantastic response to some of the new things we're doing in AI, I will be sharing some aspects of that with you this evening. This is not going to be a Salesforce promo evening, at least not to the extent that I can avoid. There were some things that I started doing when we had this intensification of conversation about measures of business performance that had been less important than measures of growth and measures of change in the definition of our market and so on. So there were some things that I started doing in 2023 that I kept on doing. One of the things I started doing in February of 2023 is a new Slack channel within Salesforce called Angles of Attack, which any pilot will recognize the pun. The angle at which a wing meets the airflow is called the angle of attack. And to some point, the steeper your angle of attack, the more you climb, unless you overdo it, and then the airflow separates from the top of the wing and the wing just falls. And it seemed to me this was an important metaphor for how you engage with customers. You need to accelerate and intensify their understanding what you can do for them, but you don't overdo it because then they just stop believing you. And so what I did is build a new Slack channel where every Monday morning you're going to have one thread, not the usual Slack thing where if you maybe miss something on Monday morning, by Wednesday it's already scrolled off the top of the screen. We're going to have one conversation per week with one specific idea about how do you get people to do something uncomfortable, which is to make changes in behavior, to do something unintuitive, like spend more instead of spend less to get greater value as a multiplier. It's a very competitively focused conversation, but I didn't want it to just be my opinions. I wanted it to be based on research, based on analyst studies, based on customer input as much as possible. And I just set myself a goal that every week the post would have a title, the title would have a verb, the verb would be, here's something you can actually do when you're spending time with customers, partners, prospects, whatever, because ultimately dogfight minutes are what pay the bills. In a sense, everything that I do that's not helping our account teams work directly and concretely with customers is kind of like, fighter pilots doing training and getting to the forward airbase and fueling the plane and checking the tires. None of that actually matters compared to the minutes. Out of a week, they might just spend minutes in the air in a dogfight. So that's what I've been doing every Monday for about 1.5 years. But this is a Thursday. So we're going to turn this whole idea inside out. We're going to let an AI turn the idea inside out for us. What I did is not hit the AI with a verb of how do we compete in our business, but I asked the AI something that it didn't necessarily have any way to answer, which is, given all the things I've been saying for the last 1.5 years, how should our customers make the best possible use of digital transformation capability, including ours, but certainly not limited to ours? So I took 65,000 words of weekly advice to our teams, threw it in to an LLM, and then I asked it the question, how does an independent IT practitioner maximize their success with what we offer them? Not how do we sell it, but how do they get value from it? And I'm going to be showing up this evening and sharing results that frankly exceeded my expectations for what an LLM could derive from a body of language that was written with one purpose in mind and turn that purpose in effect inside out and still come up with anything interesting. So in a way, this is a fireside chat with myself, because I took 1.5 years of stuff I'd been writing, threw it into an LLM and asked it, what do you think I said? What do you think this implies in answering questions that I wasn't answering when I wrote it? And I'm kind of blown away by what it produced. First of all, this is what it produced. And this is not what you're expected to read, but this is the actual output from the LLM, a bullet-pointed list of 12 ideas and a descriptive sentence for each. And if I had been tasked to take my 1.5 years of weekly commentaries and boil it down to this list, I think it might have taken me 2 days. And I don't know that I would have done as well. As a tool for taking a corpus of stuff and boiling it down to something that I read that and said, this is pretty good. This, in terms of accuracy, I'm not saying talking about good as opposed to good or bad. I'm talking about good as opposed to an accurate, reasonable, non-stupid, non-obviously AI generated, didn't really understand it. It could have fooled me. If I had written this, I wouldn't be embarrassed to share it with people. In fact, I am sharing it with you, but I'm admitting that an AI wrote it. But here's the human readable version. Here are the 12 ideas that a generative AI extracted from my 1.5 years of advice on how to convey value to a customer. And we're going to go through these with some annotation, because now that I've looked at what it thinks I was saying, I'm going to say, okay, let me prove that this is actually a reasonable thing to say. So for example, the first bullet it said is, if you want to be a successful change agent in introducing technology, in creating transformation of behavior in an organization, the first thing you're going to have to do is deep listening, which is not waiting for them to stop talking so you can say the thing you came to say. And I hammer on this with our people all the time. If you've memorized the company deck, great. Now try not to make that your mission to deliver that. And the example I like to offer is one from my time at one of the aerospace firms there in SoCal, where we were working with a customer, and we were talking about features they wanted from a new interface for managing some of their space-based assets. And they said something that fortunately I was listening hard to. If they had said, no, we need this, we need this, we need this. And I've just been, taking down the requirements, because that's what you do. Make sure you've done the requirements definition so you know the thing to deliver. But there was something about the way they described a couple of things. I said, well, what about this one here? If it takes 10 or 15 seconds to get the response from that, is that still going to be useful? And they looked at me in shock and said, well, no, if it takes more than 10 seconds, I'd never use that. And I was able to have a little bit further conversation with them and say, well, it's given the number of moving parts involved in the physical distances, speed of light being finite and whatnot, It will never take less than 10 seconds, even if all the computers were infinitely fast. And I said, oh, okay, well, never mind. I don't know what multiple of my annual salary was saved by not going ahead and doing the best we could to deliver a feature they'd said they needed, but they would never have used because it would never have met their actual need. It would never have been responsive enough to actually help their task. It's one of my favorite examples of, if you merely listen and write down what they say, that's not the same thing as deep listening. And if you just wait for them to stop talking so you can say the next thing you want to say, that's certainly not deep listening. You have to be processing what's being said. You have to be, connecting the dots, triangulating the understanding of what they actually are going to want to do with this thing they say they want. And when you do that, they'll look at you like you're a mind reader. They'll say, whoa, wow. How did you know that? Well, you didn't really know it. You just figured it out from the way they were talking about what they were going to do. In a way, it's turning yourself into an LLM. It's processing what's coming in and saying, okay, well, if that, and that, then what's the next likely thing? It's almost forcing yourself to function the way generative AI, we think, functions. To make this really work, you have to have multiple stakeholders involved from the very beginning. This is going to be difficult because the end users will want to get involved with you right away. They'll know that they're going to be feeling the pain. There are ancillary organizations that have to be happy with what you've built, even if they won't be using it themselves. And again, one of my favorite examples comes from the time when I was still working down in SoCal, when we had people who wanted to be able to work with a certain kind of data in a way that would give them, as a side effect, the ability to edit or even delete that data. Fortunately, we had succeeded in getting the legal people in that company involved at a very early stage in the definition of the system. And they were able to say, no, it would completely not be okay for ordinary users to have a set of privileges that, as a side effect, gave them the ability to edit or delete that data. That's just not something that would be acceptable. If we'd found that out later on, we probably would have had to do a very substantial redesign of the entire workflow of the task that thing was being built. We would have to figure out a way that they can do what they have to do without winding up with privileges they're not going to be allowed to have as an unavoidable side effect of that workflow. But what this demonstrates is something that some of you who've worked in software for a while may have seen, if not in this exact form, then in a very similar form, which is most of the defects, and by defects I mean either design errors or just bugs. Most defects get introduced very early on, but most of the ability to get people to come in and look at things and identify errors and fix them comes later on. It costs, it's been estimated, 640 times as much to fix something at the end instead of fixing it early on. And so if you're saying, well, before we move forward with this initiative, let's make sure we've got at least one representative of every affected group, the direct users and those who need to be happy with what those users are doing, get them in the room at the beginning. You will face resistance when you do this. They'll say, we don't really want to talk about this when it's still at a conceptual stage. We want to get involved after there's something we can actually see. No, you got to get someone in the room who can say, oh, wait a minute. No, don't even go in that direction. That's not where you want to be. You don't want to be polishing that because that's just the wrong thing. Doing that thing perfectly will not be an acceptable thing to do. And if you can't get them readily to come to the early meetings, just hit them with this number and say, if we wait till the end to bring you in and find out what doesn't work for you, it's going to cost us 600 times as much to correct the problem at that late stage. Get over your reluctance to get involved at the early stage and get someone in the room so we can fix it at the beginning instead of trying to reactively repair it at the end. The next bullet point that the system put out is make sure you're practicing human-centered design. I remember a comment in a discussion of some work that was being done in digesting the data from a satellite, and someone had spent years manually checking locations on images and feeding them in and transcribing them. In fact, my oldest son did some work as a high school student, helping out a member of the faculty at UC, where they had videotapes of drifting, burning balls of fuel. We called them flame balls, in free fall, as an experiment that was done on the space shuttle, done in a confined box, of course, not just kind of drifting around, where they had hours and hours of video and no numeric description of what was happening. Without those numeric descriptions, they really couldn't analyze the behavior. And someone said, after this manual digestion of all the data, someone said, wow, fantastic, we finally invented computer-friendly users. There's not a big supply of computer-friendly users. And one of the problems we face today is that every time you drive a car, every time you order a meal in a restaurant, you're being asked to be a computer-friendly user. It's been so cheap to put touch screens and nested menus everywhere that people wind up being slaves to the machine. And the counterexample that I like to show as a pilot is the required size and shape of the specific control knobs in a light airplane, where if you reach out to touch a knob and you think you're just raising the flaps so that the crosswind on the runway won't lift you off the runway while you're taxiing, you will know from the shape that, oops, wait, that's the landing gear knob. I want to raise the flaps, not raise the landing gear while I'm taxiing. And the shape of those knobs, distinctively recognizable by your fingers without looking at them, is not merely a good idea, it's the law. It's in the Code of Federal Regulations, cockpit control knob shape. We were talking about this in the context of modern automobiles, which increasingly, of course, have touchscreens. And now the highest end vehicles are bringing back the knob, because you can reach down, you know about where it's supposed to be, you know from the shape of what it is, and you don't have to take your eyes off. This is an example of designing the system to deal with what people need it to be, instead of doing what's easy to do and expecting people to accommodate themselves to that. This gets us to a more general topic. When people are understood to be the real experts on the task that they're trying to perform, it leads us in the direction of what might sound like a technology, but is really more about a philosophy of design, which is platform mindset. What does it really mean? Users, when they're given something that does what they asked for, will often realize what they really needed. And they need to be respected for their ability to envision more than you probably did when you were doing your initial concept of the system. And having it be low code and no code is not just a cool thing. It allows the ownership of the improvement of the system to be much closer to the people who really understand the problem. It's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more maintainable, it's going to converge more quickly on what it needs to be. And oddly enough, I'm going to quote someone I don't normally quote here, which is Microsoft Research, in a paper they did about online experimentation. And if you have good resolution on your screen, you'll see a little quote at the bottom right from some guy named Bill Gates saying, we need to use A/B testing methodology a lot more than we do today. Meaning, instead of trying to exhaustively decide what the priorities of the design are going to be up front, a priori, as the quote from that paper says, turns out, generally speaking, we're terrible at that. No matter how hard you try, accurately understanding how people will want to use it, what features they'll value, what habits they'll develop before they're actually interacting with it, generally is not a cost-effective way to move forward on one of these initiatives. And it kind of relates to the earlier point I made about deep listening, is that people won't necessarily even be able to tell you what would make something useful or not useful until they're interacting with it. You'll sometimes hear the phrase minimum viable product. It doesn't mean the worst thing that can be done that's any good. It means something good enough that people will say, okay, this is worth using, and now I'm interacting with it, and now I'm telling you what more would be really helpful. And then they become fully engaged with you, and instead of being opposed to your idea that took too long and wound up doing the wrong thing, they become interested in your idea that is the promise of becoming what they need and does something useful enough that they want to invest in making it better right from the beginning. The analogy that's quoted later on in the paper is when someone says, you know, Tiger Woods is really good, but not every ball he hits is perfect. But imagine if when he were playing, he were allowed to do 4 shots and pick the one that worked the best. What would that do for his game? And if we can allow ourselves the luxury of getting a couple of shots out there and letting users tell us what was good and what really helped them, the learning goes in both directions at a really fantastic rate. And the analogy that I often offer is that if you look at the way we try to deliver stuff at Salesforce, we have something called, Sales Cloud or Service Cloud. It's like a fully solved Rubik's Cube. If you just look at it, okay, I understand this object. It's a cube. It's got a white side, a red side, a yellow side, a blue side. I can grasp this object. I can buy this thing and be doing CRM tomorrow or field service or whatever. But the important thing is that when there's something that it isn't doing quite right, I shouldn't have to take it apart and start all over again. I should be able to give it a twist. Now, the internal hardware that makes it possible to just give a Rubik's Cube a twist is not simple. But the person who's solving the puzzle doesn't need to know anything about that. They don't need to understand the mechanisms on the inside any more than a developer actually needs to understand the guts of our global query optimizer. The whole point is to make it invisible, unnecessary to think about it, have it just work like magic. And if you do this right, then you build an ecosystem. You have other people saying, wow, I can add value to this thing. I don't need to understand it all the way down to the underpinnings. I can add value to it. And this conversation came up earlier today when someone was saying, they've got customers asking us, how are we using AI? And I said, asking us how we use AI is like asking us, how do you use electricity? It's like asking Hilton Hotels, how do you use plumbing? It's like asking Lamborghini, how do you use rubber? You can't do what we do without watt hours of power. You can't do what Hilton does without being able to have flush toilets in every room. You can't do what Lamborghini does without tires on the cars. But watts and pipes and tires are not the product. The outcome is the product. And whenever possible, if a customer says, we'd like to talk about doing our AI project with you, I kind of want to pull out the Galaxy Quest Omega 13 device and say, let's pretend you didn't say that. Let's pretend we're having a conversation about customer churn reduction or team member onboarding time improvement or something that's an actual measurable business outcome. Because there's always going to be different ways of doing this from a technology point of view. If we make this successful acquisition, implementation, and demonstration of a technology the goal, I'm going to get there in a few more slides. I'm going to have some thoughts on that I'll share with a few more images to accompany it. But this leads us to the next topic. This is the next bullet point. Remember, these things you're seeing on the left side of the screen, these aren't words that I wrote. These are words that a generative AI produced when I asked it, what the heck have I been talking about for the last year and a half? And one of the bullet points it came up with was, well, apparently you think that continuous innovation is important and that fostering a mindset of continuous innovation is important. That's a really good point, and it makes me want to explain why I think that's true. Innovation is a word that lots of people use, and they say, we're going to be more innovative. My response to that is that this is very much like saying, I'm going to get rich or I'm going to lose weight. It's a description of an outcome of a behavior, but it doesn't tell you what the behavior needs to be to produce that outcome. Peter Drucker, who often gets there ahead of the rest of us, did describe what he called the 7 sources of innovation opportunity, but in my mind, 3 of them are the most important for people who do what I do, what many of you on this call do for a living, which is get people excited about something that terrifies them, ready to work hard at something that they'd rather not have to do at all, which is to achieve behavior change, which is what real innovation is. Those 3 things are this: incongruities, new knowledge, changes in perception. What's incongruities? Incongruities is looking at something that you've seen before like you've never seen it before. Our CEO, Mark Benioff, uses the expression the eye of the child or the beginner's mind, another expression that's used. Being able to look at something and say, why do we put up with that? And then the answer is resolvable by new knowledge. There's an expression called Chesterton's fence. You've heard of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the correct one. Chesterton's fence is if someone sees a fence and wants to tear it down, make them explain to you why it was built in the first place. It didn't just grow spontaneously overnight. It didn't come up in the night like a mushroom. Someone had a reason for building that fence. And if you don't know what that reason was, how can you possibly have a credible opinion on whether tearing that fence down is an okay thing to do? It's a logic exercise. New knowledge allows you to look at that incongruity and say, oh, okay, that made sense at the time. It's like people asking, why were there 2-digit years in all that code that we had to address during Y2K? Well, because it used to be really, really expensive to do 4-digit years. Memory and storage cost many orders of magnitude more at that time. Okay, fine, new knowledge. Now we know we don't have to do that. Great, now let's move forward. But then you come up against, or you come up on the opportunity of, changes in perception. When I started here 17 years ago, the idea that you would store critical customer data in a remote system that you did not physically control was novel. And I spent many of my hours during my first few years here getting this idea of this crazy cloud thing even allowed to come in the door, let alone being invited to sit down and have dinner. Over time, it's become clear that the scale and the professionalism and the ability to respond of a professionally administered cloud facility are more than most companies and even most national governments can afford to do on their own. But that was a massive change in perception, and only when that had been achieved could the innovations that we now sometimes call cloud, but we hardly ever even say cloud anymore. It's like saying cell phone. We just call it a phone. It's like saying digital camera. We just call it a camera. It's like saying hybrid car. We just call that a car now. And to say cloud computing sounds kind of quaint right now. Like, what's the other kind? What you do when the internet is down? And innovation at Salesforce has demonstrated this 3-step sequence. The moment of incongruity has often been described as our CEO saying, why do people have this great stuff that they use at home like eBay and Google, that they don't take a class to learn to use it? They don't need to take another class every time that there's a change. And they welcome the change as improvement. And why is their attitude at work so different? Why can't we fix that? It wasn't a question about how do we make CRM work better. It was a question about how do we deal with the reasons why technology adoption and use in the workplace seems to be happening on a different planet than what was happening in people's own homes. Well, we worked on that. One of the reasons we were able to work on that in a way that had not really worked before for centralized application service providers, remember ASPs? They had failures to scale. They didn't have the advantages of multi-tenancy at the data layer or being able to configure metadata instead of writing actual code. This new knowledge allowed us to achieve levels of pace of innovation and so on. And that was something you just couldn't do before. But then you had to do the hard work, which is change of perception, getting people to feel like, oh, okay, it's not so much that the cloud is cheaper but more risky, it's that it's doing a better job at these things than I can afford to do myself, so that I don't have to worry about those things. This is a conversation we had with a well-known electric vehicle maker whose leading figure is a famous innovator, and his people said, if we aren't practically digging the silicon for the transistors with our own hands, he's not going to believe that we're being really innovative here. And we had to do what we could to help them achieve a different perception. It's not that we're keeping you from being innovative by using the stuff we give you. It's that we're letting you start innovating at a higher level. You aren't innovating in the basement, you're innovating in the living room. You're innovating at the penthouse level, doing things that create unique experience for people instead of doing the things that everybody has to do, like, security. But what really makes the difference between innovation and just improvement, incremental refinement, is not really going to be innovative. If you're saying, how do we deal with our established rivals? How do we reduce our familiar costs? How do we solve our known problems? How do we do more with our legacy skills? You may be doing very valuable iterative improvement. You probably aren't doing actual innovation, because actual innovation is a shift of focus and not just a sharpening of the focus. For example, when the iPod was first introduced, it was introduced into a space where MP3 digital music players were a well-established consumer electronics product category. And it was initially perceived as a fairly expensive and not very feature-rich MP3 player. But Steve Jobs was not focusing on building a better MP3 player. He wanted to give people their favorite songs in their pocket. The MP3 player, the iPod itself, was a means to that end. And the iPod plus iTunes and the change of perception of the recording companies from I'm going to guard jealously my copyrights to I'm going to sell Steve Jobs my songs and let him resell them at 99 cents a song. That massive change in perception created such a change in behavior that 3 years later, the Oxford English Dictionary added a new word never seen in the Oxford Dictionary before, podcast. We hadn't previously called downloading stuff to listen to it a podcast. The iPod gave us that word, and even though they don't do iPods anymore, we still call it podcasting. And that, in my mind, is a demonstration of what it means to innovate and not merely iteratively improve. It's vital that you not think if we can only make it good enough, they'll want it. Because making it good enough that people want to give up their familiar behaviors is a really, really difficult thing to do. Gartner has found that saying, oh, if we can just make the customers happier, they'll change their behavior. Not so much, especially in B2B settings where taking risk and introducing change is perceived as potentially career ending, and achieving change may or may not get you any real rewards. Interestingly, they've found that if you can promise them, if you look them in the eye and say, adding this new thing will not make you give up the things that are making you successful now. You will not be burning your boats. You will not be leaving behind the things that have made you a master of your domain. If you can say it's going to integrate with everything that you've got now, and then add new capability to it, which you'll use as you see fit, which you will master at your own pace, a threefold improvement in decision confidence. It would be so unfortunate if you thought, oh gosh, we could just add this one feature. If we could just add this one thing. Oh, they say they don't like this one thing. Well, let's turn it sideways and paint it blue, and then they'll be okay with it. And what you're doing is looking at the wrong end of the camel here. The problem is it's the things they're afraid they'll be giving up that are preventing them from moving forward with your great idea. Not that there aren't enough pluses, but they're just worried about, in some cases, just one minus. If there's one thing that they know they rely on having to get their job done today, and you say, well, that's going to go away. At that point, you may just have an objector who is not going to be calmed no matter how many great new things you're able to promise instead. It's called endowment effect. And there are any number of experiments that have been done that show that what someone will pay to get something is considerably less than they would demand to be paid to give it up once they've got it. It sounds kind of weird, but someone said, well, if you were a Neolithic proto-human and you kill a beast that is going to feed you and your family for a week, and someone wants to give you a pile of pretty rocks for it instead, your first reaction is going to be, well, yeah, but I don't know if I can go out and find another beast to kill. In a scarcity economy, it makes sense to value what you have more than the cost of getting it in the first place, because you're not sure you're going to be able to replace it if you sell it. You don't have a liquid bidirectional economy. Getting people to think in terms of abundance, hey, come on, good luck with that. You're talking about the wiring of the human brain. But this endowment effect matters. It is also really important that you be looking ahead, that you be living in the future and thinking, suppose this thing does catch on at scale. What are the implications of doing this thing at 10 times the size, at 100 times the size, 1,000 times the size of the pilot project? This is actually the major factor in the so-called AI winters of the late 1980s, is that there were a lot of architectures, rule-based expert systems, for example, that prototyped great. But if you tried to run them as production systems for years, you wound up with thousands of rules in your rule-based system, and half of them needed to be examined and maybe refreshed every year. This is the actual data from Digital Equipment Corp, may it rest in peace, on their XCon expert system. They had 6,200 rules, half of which needed significant maintenance on an average year. And I was at one conference where they came to show the system. I was at the next conference and they came in looking pretty battered and bloodied to show the knowledge maintenance tool they'd had to build. As they said, it was a far more difficult exercise than building the tool to apply that knowledge. And we are dealing with that right now with AI. Because if you look at machine learning, you can demonstrate some very interesting pilot projects. You can do some terrific demonstrations. But the notion of an ML ops architecture, a machine learning ops architecture, the workflow of continually examining, updating, adding new knowledge, checking for conflicts, for ambiguities, for a piece of knowledge that seems to mean one thing but could easily be construed by a purely logical system with no common sense whatever in a completely different way. ML ops is a much bigger problem than doing a great ML pilot. And if you're not going to be given the resources to take the idea to production and maintain it effectively for years, then you're going to have maybe a tiny little flash in the pan or maybe a great big expensive money pit. And what I can tell you from my data from the coalface in our industry right now is that CFOs, chief financial officers, are in the room more than they used to be. And if they see something that looks like it's going to be a one-time expense that doesn't turn into long-range capability, or a capability whose costs are going to grow disproportionately to the value they provide, they're going to be among the biggest objectors. You have to be ready to talk about this. This is so much a problem because people have a perception that we're over the hump on this with AI, with things like the EU AI Act. The EU AI Act should not be called an act, because what it is a regulation tasking the EU member states to write acts, to pass pieces of legislation that carry out certain goals with many potential exceptions, with much room for interpretation. Is it a good thing that the EU AI Act is out there? Yes, it is. Does it solve the problem? No, it allows us to begin having a process of solving the problem. It allows us to begin that process with some shared understandings of what are the criteria for success and what are the standards that should be met. But also take a look at the time span. This is the cartoon that was run in The Economist, where here's the cage, we're going to put AI in a couple of years. And when the cage is finally ready, the AI is a lot bigger than the cage. We're talking about actual rules saying, yeah, well, high-risk systems will be addressed 24 to 36 months from now. That's a long time. 24 to 36 days is a pretty significant amount of time in this industry today. I can tell you that just from the pace at which we have introduced new products and technologies within our own company alone. So how do you do this? Well, rather than planning to build the cage for the beast, what about if we declaw the beast before it has a chance to get too big to cage? We have worked with multiple partners to create what we call the Zero Copy Partner Network. And instead of having many copies of data casually proliferating around the systems as different machine learning tasks get their crack at deriving insight from them, what if we build architectures in which it can look at it, provide a response, but it doesn't get to keep it. It doesn't get to keep a copy. And it is possible to build systems that, rather than trying to contain failure modes, simply preempt those failure modes. And thinking in that way, thinking not how do we make it work, but how do we make sure we're not going to be unhappy with the way it works after it's been scaled by a factor of 1,000, 10,000, after it's been running for a couple of years by people who weren't there when it was being built. This is going to be very important to the real credibility and the continued willingness to invest in AI past the period that some people like to call the hype cycle that it's in right now. Now, these next 2 points, again, I remind you that an LLM told me I had apparently thought were important. These are not words that I wrote. An LLM wrote these words after reading what I'd been writing for a year and a half. Highlight the pain points and sell the excitement. If you show up in a place where people think they're doing a pretty good job, and say, I'm here to give you a tool that will help you do a good job, to some degree, you're insulting them. You're kind of saying, yeah, you're tolerable, but we're going to make you better. No one really wants to be told that they need to be fixed. And among the most interesting opportunities I get is when a company has made a decision that we're going to be brought in, and my job is to show up and get people hungry for it instead of vaguely resentful and suspicious. And it's a great thing to do, and I treasure the chances to do it, because it's how I get a chance to do a mind meld with people and say, really, tell me what you're most afraid of here. What is the biggest reason why you don't want to go forward in this? Okay, great. Now let's drag that out into the light. Not treat the fact that you feel that way as some kind of confession of weakness, but as a legitimate concern that we should be discussing. And if you can get people, before you're talking about your new idea, to have a frank and candid conversation about the things that drive them crazy every day. One of my favorite stories, this is from Reader's Digest, which tells you how long ago this was, is a woman who went to work at a government agency. She was a nurse in a VA hospital, if I recall it correctly. She was working in an exam room. The exam room had a sink for washing hands and stuff. The sink had a drip. There was a bucket under the sink to catch the drips. She worked there for 20 years. And as she approached her retirement date, she realized that the bucket had itself developed a leak. The bucket had been there for a long time, gotten some rust, and eventually the rust gave way as rust does. And she called up someone and said, I've been here for 20 years. Just before I leave, it would be so great if this could get fixed. And sure enough, someone showed up that day with a new bucket. Not really what she had in mind, but getting people to say candidly and without reservation, this is what's driving me nuts, and this is what I think really needs to be done. Involve them in that solution, and then they will become your partners in polishing it and making it work at scale, instead of being skeptics who are expecting the worst and happy to confirm their expectations. This notion of loss aversion, it has been documented that people are roughly twice as likely to resent giving something up as they are to appreciate the benefit of getting it in the first place. So it's just really important to realize it's just a piece of human behavior, and you got to work with it and not think that you can change it. And if they don't trust you, forget it. We had a massive exercise a little while ago. Some of you may have forgotten about the so-called Log4j vulnerability. Log4j, I'm told, is pronounced Log4j by the people who know these things. That was a little piece of code that was embedded in libraries, that were embedded in other libraries, that were embedded in yet other libraries. And I know some companies that did a real forensic audit and realized they had to go 9 levels down to establish that, yep, we got this thing. And fixing it for many companies was hard, and we felt really good about how quickly we were able to say very crisply, we've identified every possible place where this could be a factor, and they've all been fixed. It was a really great thing to be able to say, because people are beginning to understand that this famous XKCD cartoon is reality, that there's an awful lot of stuff that's relying on one little open source Python library that everything else is calling, and it's being maintained by someone in Nebraska. Nothing wrong with Nebraska. It's just a randomly chosen example here. But really understanding the supply chain of the software you're building, this goes back to the famous Turing lecture, Reflections on Trusting Trust, in which it was shown that you got to go all the way down the food chain and really have a high level of confidence in the quality and the non-maliciousness of the code that's incorporated. If you got a chance to incorporate a feature, but it uses stuff whose software provenance is not demonstrable, you got to build the scaffolding to test things, as the unfortunate recent issue of the misconfigured antivirus update that brought down systems around the world because they hadn't built systems with the guardrails, with the seat belts, with the airbags. They'd optimized for execution when it worked, and had not done the additional investment to guard against foreseeable mistakes. Now we get to start talking about the things that you're going to be doing for the outside world. This has mostly been so far about how you get teams excited about building and deploying new stuff. But what about the things you have to be doing to communicate with customers, citizens, patients in healthcare, students and faculty if you're in the education sector? Omni-channel engagement. When Angela Ahrendts had I think either just left Burberry for Apple or hadn't quite left Burberry yet, she said, you know, if you're not doing omni-channel today, it's really not marketing. To say omni-channel marketing doesn't make sense because email marketing is email and telephone marketing is robocalling. Marketing now is by definition omni-channel, and some of the best visualization of an omni-channel world was done by all people by Corning Glass, as in the people who make the Gorilla Glass that keeps your phone from breaking all the time. They've got some videos called A Day Made of Glass that are fantastic visualizations of a world where practically every flat surface around you is giving you information or mediating action, where road signs are actively telling you, here's 2 different exits, you could take this one's faster. Right now we all do this with stuff that's in our cars, but imagine if the road sign itself could just say, don't even think about taking this exit, the next one is going to be far faster for you. When you're driving past a billboard, imagine if all the cars passing a particular billboard on the way to the stadium at the university where there's a big game, imagine if you knew from the nav systems of all those passing cars that 90% of them were all headed for the game, and the roadside billboards could all be changing their content to speak to that audience about maybe pre-game activities or post-game dinner specials at the restaurants or whatever. That's not just a crazy idea. And in fact, it was at one of these meetings years ago where I shared the discovery I made that there's a patent on that idea of roadside advertising dynamically adapting to the known destinations of the passing cars from their nav system inputs. And that patent is owned by GM. Because what is GM's biggest asset? Imagine if GM could monetize the attention span of the people driving the cars that sold them over the lifetime of their owning those cars. Imagine if they could own that audience, not just as owners of cars, but just as people who do stuff. That's what omni-channel engagement really implies. And this is something we've known for years, and you've probably noticed this behavior yourselves. Most retail transactions today begin on a mobile device where you're out there with your family and notice something, you say, gee, I wonder if anyone makes something that does this. You start the inquiry, but then you get home and you use the PC or the tablet to look at something with bigger pictures or maybe compare some different websites, and you want to transition that experience without friction or jumping over chasms from one device to the next. We actually had data a few years ago that showed people were taking a screenshot on their phone and emailing it to themselves so that they could pick up where they had left off, because there was not this notion of a single seamless experience. And no matter how much AI you throw at silos, they don't become non-silos. You have to engineer the integrated seamless experience before putting intelligence into it is going to create real value for the end users. And if you think I'm overstating this, here's a graph of market share activity for Windows and OS X over the period from 2015 to 2024. This is 10 years. And it looks like a pretty steady state world. Most people are Windows users, significant minority, maybe slightly increasing minority are Mac users. You speak to those audiences, you're doing what you need to do. Peter, look, we got a website. You can look at it in Chrome on both of those machines. Why should we do anything different? Well, if you look at Windows 10, which has been around since 2015, and Windows 11, which has been around for 3 years now, you might get a different picture here, because Windows 11 only now recently reached half the market share of Windows 10. People aren't adopting new generations of Windows because they're real excited about it. They're just using it because it's there. It's like the running water of their IT. It's just the thing they've got. Adding new features to it doesn't get them particularly excited because they're just using it like you would use, your water faucet. It's just a utility. And in fact, Android has a bigger market share than Windows as of about 6 years ago. More people are Android users than Windows users on any given day, and many more people are iOS users than are Mac OS users on any given day. And lots of people have an iPhone running iOS and a PC or laptop running Windows. And if you ask them, are you a Mac user or a PC user, they'll just kind of look at you and say, huh? I'm a Pinterest user. I'm a Google user. They are using the capability they get. They aren't really thinking themselves as device users anymore. What that means is that your obligation as someone visualizing and delivering experiences for people cannot be, I'm building a Windows app. Cannot be, I'm building a website. It has to be, I'm engineering an experience for people who have one set of needs when they're walking around the streets, one set of needs when they're driving, one set of needs when they're with their family at the dinner table. And I need to make sure I'm bringing them all in on every strand of that spider web to an experience to which I can then add intelligence in a useful way. But the experience concept has to come first. Because if it's used to do the same old things, what's the point? Innovation is behavior change. If there's no behavior change, you may have had an interesting invention. You probably have not achieved an innovation. Here's an example. Here's a Windows 11 screen, and you know, it bears an eerie resemblance to a Xerox screen from 1981. If I'd gone into a 40-year coma at the end of the 1980s, and I sat down at a brand new Windows machine in my first moments of waking up, I would have a pretty good idea of how to use it if I'd seen a Xerox star in 1983. That's kind of sad, because when you think about it, at the time, achieving a realistic simulation of a physical desktop on your computer screen, that was a huge accomplishment. Wow, documents, folders? Wow, this is just the way I work in real life. Yeah, but people don't do that anymore, do they? They don't so much pass physical documents around in and out of their inboxes. And the idea that you're going to give them a digital simulation of what their office looked like in 1980 and call that version 11 doesn't get me very excited. Because really, what do people do now? They have conversations, they form networks, they discover resources and create action. This is where the systems need to go, not adding intelligence to a 40-year-old concept of how people do their work, but to look at how people want to do their work and add intelligence to that. And that's where we achieve real innovation. This is what Stuart Butterfield, who was running a little company called Tiny Speck, that turned into a company called Slack, for which we spent $28 billion a few years ago, said no meaningful innovation has not involved significant behavior change. And interestingly, it's not just people whose behavior we're trying to change anymore. Now we're trying to change the behavior of the machines as well, because the machines have behaviors. The machines had a behavior called being a chatbot. Give me the logic network of all the conversations I might have to have and the flow chart that I'm going to have to follow, and I will do that repeatable, predictable process very, very well. And if it doesn't work, I'll throw you over a human who's going to have to ask all the questions all over again, because I don't know how to tell them the state of play. I'm just going to have to say, oh, okay, I give up. Here, start over again with a person. All right, that's chatbots. Copilots are more capable, but still work with a fairly finite list of things they've been asked to do. Can a copilot help you understand your spreadsheet or generate some slides, or, as someone was saying on the call earlier, write a resume that clearly looks like it was written by a machine? Yeah, they can do that. Where we're trying to go right now with software agents is rather different. We don't want them to be tasked with predetermined networks of known questions. We want them to have contextual access to data and the ability to work within general topics constrained by guardrails and designed to expect that there will be times when they can't finish the problem, and designed to do a straightforward handoff to a human who comes into the conversation immediately informed of where it was and maybe even have some idea of where it was going. We're trying to achieve behavior change on the machine side now, rather than trying to change the behavior of people, because people's behavior is very difficult to change. Is it working? Well, if you ordered any new textbooks from Wiley at the beginning of the academic year, you may have been working with an agent. Their ability to onboard the huge seasonal peak of people that they need and have them functioning at a level that allows them to answer questions from faculty members or students or whatever, that's demonstrable. The reduction in agent training time is palpable. The ROI has been huge. So this is not a hypothetical. This is something that's actually happening now. Algo is a telecommunications provider. They're seeing faster response times. Service calls get resolved more quickly. And crucially, we're starting to hold these things to a very high standard of accuracy. And that is something that I think is it's about time we started measuring accuracy and not just measuring how quickly they can rewrite your chili recipe in iambic pentameter. And Bacchus systems, this is crucial. Remember I talked before about if you want them to be confident in trying the new thing, make sure they're confident that it will integrate with the old thing. We made it clear to this customer that the 230 custom flows that they'd built and flows from their other managed packages that were interfacing with their stuff would all be accessible to the agent, which would be able to use all of that past investment. And this is key to getting people genuinely enthusiastic, is saying you're not going to be giving up stuff that you trust and that's been reliable for you. We're going to add value to that. So where do we go from here? Well, first of all, we got to appreciate, this is a phrase I don't think I stole the phrase I'm about to use from George Gilbert, but what he was talking about reminded me of it when someone said, hey, look, we're in the BlackBerry era here. I remember having a BlackBerry for my first 2 years at Salesforce back in 2007, 2008, 2009. We took a while to adopt the iPhone because there were security issues we wanted to address. And he made a really great point that talking about agents right now, which a lot of people are doing, is like talking about microservices as if they were individual services. But some of you may be familiar with the famous memo that Jeff Bezos at Amazon wrote, where he said, from now on, everything we do is going to be exposed to other units of the company in the form of a consumable service. We're not going to write applications. We're going to compose services, and they'll be able to recompose those. And when you look at an Amazon page, it's not a web page. It's not an HTML page somewhere. It's the output of an orchestration of, I've been reliably told, about 500 different services are working together in real time to compose what you most need to see at that moment, on whatever device you're in whatever mode of inquiry you're in. And George made the point that agents, like microservices, are only going to become really effective when they work with other services in networks of services. And building a control framework to do that is an area where a lot of us are still figuring out what that's going to have to do. And what it reminded me of is something written 30 years ago by some guys at MIT, Rosenstein and Vladkin, in their book Rules of Encounter, that talked about how do you build a control mechanism for networks of agents that prevents them from getting into sort of a game theory competition with each other that's not constrained by any ideas of ethics, that's not constrained by any ideas of, well, you shouldn't do that, that doesn't require you to enumerate every single thing they shouldn't do, but build an environment in which agents can constructively interact. If you wanted to know where the real opportunity is going to be, it's not going to be building a better agent. It's going to be devising the environment in which many agents, each built to do a piece of a task, can be expected to cooperate and not go into fratricidal mutual assured destruction and game theory competition against each other. George also said something really important, which is that we're still going to have traditional software. We're still going to use accounting software for the things that need to be repeatable, precise, and accurate. Those will continue to have attributes that are important. They'll function with greater efficiency, with lower development cost, and with repeatability and precision and accuracy, which are still kind of important things. And the agents are going to be doing the stuff that you can't do with traditional software. And this is something Stephen Wolfram has said. Don't test generative AI by seeing how well it does something you can do now and be disappointed that it cost more to only do it 70% as well. That's not a measure of the failure of the AI. That's a measure of your failure to shift your focus, as I said before, instead of just sharpening the focus on what you already do. Go looking around the dark corners of the basement for the things that no one's even tried to build computer-aided capability to do. But then the question becomes, fine, now what's the interface layer between the things we know how to do and will continue to do with software as we've always known it, and the new capability that will be wrapped around that and interact with that in areas that are difficult to specify and therefore difficult to test. So again, the coexistence layer, like the control layer, is an area where there's huge opportunity for thinking, development of products, and introduction of new practices. This reminded me of another piece of science fiction from 45 years ago in James Hogan's book, Two Faces of Tomorrow, and some lunar construction workers tell an AI, there's a ridge over there, get rid of it. And says, any constraints on that? And they say, no, just do it. And says, fine. It takes the mass driver that it was using to shoot payloads of rock into Earth orbit to build a space station out of those rocks, and uses it to bomb the ridge out of existence, in the process almost killing the workers. But hey, no one told it that was a problem. And I love the sentence a few pages later that the people analyzing the system said it seemed quite proud of itself. Yeah, these things will be proud of themselves when they come up with an answer that no human would have devised, because they don't know why a human wouldn't have done it that way. And it's going to be a problem if we have to tell them every single thing they're not allowed to do. So building control frameworks for these things is going to be a huge area for potential contribution. Who's going to control the handoff from what the machine can do unsupervised or with negligible supervision, and who's going to control the accountability for what the machine does? These are very important questions, not merely technical questions. I want to leave you with one thought. Where we are right now, I said before, it's the BlackBerry era. 1980s AI was kind of like trying to build flying machines that were things with flapping wings that people strapped on. We looked at birds and said, oh, they fly, let's build machines that do what birds do. Didn't scale. Didn't really work very well at all at any scale, and certainly didn't scale. So we had to get off the flapping wings existence proof and say, well, yeah, but how does lift happen around a wing? How do we build wings and then build things that can propel very, very big wings? And that's how we wind up with something like a 747, which does not look at all like a much larger version of an ornithopter. It is a different application of more fundamental ideas in a way that allows us to scale. We're not going to colonize Mars with this thing. No matter how big are the engines I put on it, it's not going to get us to Mars. This is. It doesn't look anything like a bigger, improved 747. It's being developed with an iterative design willingness to build something very expensive and blow it up and learn as much as you can from that process, and the next one works better. And the speed at which the development of this technology is happening is unlike anything that's happened in that industry domain in the past, because of a readiness to build it, test it, have it fail, and learn from that. They are not playing to minimize their losses. They are playing to maximize their wins. They're not paying to minimize their embarrassments. They're spending what it takes to achieve what hasn't been done before. And it's so much a different way of pursuing these goals than we've had for the many previous decades. But even that is going to be different. So in the same way that quantum computing is going to be as different from the current generative AI as a Starship is from a 747, DNA-based computing, which Google has made some very significant strides on, with the parallelism it can produce, the energy efficiencies that it can achieve, is quite possibly going to be as different from what we've got now as a Starship and then eventually, a warp drive would be, hypothetically would be, from anything we're doing now. So do not laser focus on the challenges, the opportunities, the areas for refinement of current generative AI technology. Yeah, those are important, but they're kind of like worrying about tread life when you're trying to build a faster Lamborghini. There are people who are going to do that. You will be buying their services. For almost all of us, the question is going to be, what are the problems that we've learned to ignore because they weren't solvable? And how do we learn to see them all over again? That's what's going to be real exciting. Because something I said about a year ago just came back to haunt me today. I said, today saying ChatGPT when you mean generative AI is kind of like saying Alta Vista in the year 2000, because Alta Vista had 18% share of the internet search business. This thing called Google only had 7%. I think we know that Google turned out to be a little more important. And there are things that are happening now that don't seem nearly as massive and world changing as something like, ChatGPT does. And yet, being ready to imagine that we're going to do it completely differently, maybe in 3 to 5 years, almost certainly in 10 to 15 years, is going to be really important. Because incremental improvement of the thing we've got now is just going to give you, not a 747, but an A380. And an A380 turned out to be too big and turned out not to be commercially viable at all. And it would be a shame to see AI work go in that same direction, as it's kind of showing some hints it might. Now, William Gibson famously said, the future's already here, just not very evenly distributed. And I've used that quote many times. But in the course of sourcing that quote recently, I ran across what might be a better one from Alvin Toffler, as in Future Shock Alvin Toffler, where he said, to put it another way, the present's grinding to a halt. If you tell people the future's already here and I'm going to give you some of it, maybe they'll be interested. If you can show them conclusively that the present they've been living in isn't going to last much longer, that it's going to be necessary to make changes in the underlying architecture of designing experiences before you design, quote, applications, unquote, of creating holistic understanding of a patient instead of different medical specialties, each understanding a different organ in the human body, to do what these things allow us to do that we have not done before, not judge them by our ability to do the familiar with some iambic pentameter thrown in, but instead to do things that computers have really been pretty lousy at doing up until now in ways that are useful enough to be worth the effort of improving them. It's going to be a lot more exciting. And the last thought I want to leave you with for the evening is from someone you might not have expected me to be quoting this evening, Volodymyr Zelensky of the Ukraine, who said, every day is not so much a chance to decide what better handle you're going to put in your suitcase, but what baggage you're going to leave behind. Lots of people want to sell you a trolley to wheel around your suitcase, or a nicer handle, or a new shoulder strap for that suitcase. But leaving the baggage behind may be the more powerful way to do it. And ultimately, the future isn't a place that we go or a thing that happens to us. It's the choices we make tomorrow morning, or maybe the choices we make before we go to bed tonight, the conversations we have, the problems we decide we're going to allow ourselves to see after years of thinking it made more sense to ignore them. That's where this needs to go. And the logo that I use for my unit here at Salesforce is this one with the statement, we don't predict, we reveal. I don't think I've done a lot of predicting tonight. As much as possible, I hope I've shown you things that were indisputably true, and maybe suggested some inevitabilities. A rock that's at this point on the top of a hill is pretty likely going to roll down it. That's really not a prediction. And I hope I've conveyed my sense that these things are pretty much certainties. And the question then is, how do we participate in them instead of letting them be inflicted on us? And that's what I had for you tonight. And I appreciate always the chance to find out what the heck is happening inside my head by being asked by you guys every year. And Roger, I guess back to you.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for the overwhelming the new ideas. Does anyone have any further questions? We have
those are kind of data intensive charts. Roger, you'll get a PDF. This time I won't make you wait till December for it the way I did last year.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to put up another PowerPoint, but if anyone has questions, please here we go. Please unmute yourself and express your question. And
sometimes people tell me their heads are spinning too hard after one of those. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn, and it's not an imposition to come back to me with a question a day or two from now after you've had a chance to think about it, because finding out what questions were in your mind is my payback for what you've allowed me to inflict on you for the last hour. So thank you very much.
Well, this has been very profound ideas. You know, the present will not last much longer. That's kind of a scary idea.
If I didn't scare you at least a little bit, then I definitely didn't do my job.
And leaving the baggage
It
behind.
scares me. Hey, you know, it scares me. But you know
Great
why?
idea.
Not because of any concerns I have about whether my job's going to be destroyed or not, but it's not so much that it scares me, but I've got 8-year-old and 12-year-old grandchildren. And the responsibility I think that many of us feel to children or grandchildren or other family members of being a useful guide to what are the things they need to be good at doing to have a contribution to make in future years. I think that's something that a lot of us feel, whether we're conscious of feeling it or not. I think it's a lot of the difficulty in the world today comes from people wondering if their kids are going to be better off than they were. And a lot of this is about having an approach to the opportunities and not a fear of the changes that allows to be that good counselor to people who are depending on us.
Very, very well stated. I'd like to ask everyone who's still here to please provide some feedback on the extended messages you've just heard from Peter Coffey. We've got a link there at the bottom of the screen. And we'd very much appreciate your feedback on tonight's presentation. So, Peter, thank you so much again for making time to share your ideas with us. And I know for myself, I'm going to be listening to your message many times, repeated many times over in order to be able to comprehend.
Well, I value that every year you guys are pretty reliable about doing a recording, because I'm not very good about doing that for myself. And I have coworkers and partners who've indicated that they will look forward to having that available. So thank you guys always for making this highlight of my early autumn for so many years.
All right, I'm going to stop recording now.
Yeah. Okay, great.